Welcome to Engineering Influence, a podcast from the American Council of Engineering Companies. And today we are continuing with our latest research from the ACEC Research Institute. Not too long ago, we took a look at Q4 of the Engineering Business Sentiment Survey with Joe Bates. And today we are joined by Jon Gray, principal at Rockport Analytics, to talk about the macroeconomic look at the impact of the engineering industry at large, and that's the economic assessment of the engineering industry and the five-year forecast to go along with that, newly published for 2024. Jon, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Jeff. Great to be with you here this morning.
You know, it really appreciate the work you put into this. This is how many years now have you done the forecast for the Institute?
Yeah, this is actually the fifth year. So the fifth year anniversary of the research. So a lot of interesting stuff, and we've got some really, really cool trends that we've been able to dig up over those 5 years.
And that's really, I think, the differentiator now. And I was talking to Joe about the sentiment survey, and the same idea is that after a while, doing enough of these surveys, you start to actually be able to get some trend data that can now create leading economic indicators or additional, more in-depth numbers for a lot of analysts inside the industry and outside the industry to take a look at how engineering and design services are impacting the macroeconomy.
Yeah, exactly. As an economist, data is our friend, and having those long-term trends that we can build into the models, because part of the research that we're going to be talking about this morning is forward-looking, right? We're developing a forecast of where we think the industry is going. And so the more data we have, historical data, the better the models are that allow us to build those forecasts.
So let's delve into the report. So what has changed year to year now, looking at the general macroeconomic impact of the engineering design services industry on the U.S. economy? How are we looking in terms of GDP, in terms of employment, those top line indicators?
Yeah, Jess. So, the last full year of data that we have is obviously 2023 in terms of a calendar year. We're not through 2024 yet. And a lot of the data that we collect is reported by government agencies, and there is a bit of a lag sometimes with those statistics. And so we're really looking backwards and engaging performance for 2023. What we've seen is that the industry continues to grow. We see really a lot of strength in the industry, in particular different parts of the industry. I think we'll talk about some of those component parts where we see strength specifically here in a few minutes. But growth is moderating a little bit, right? Coming out of the pandemic, we saw really strong double-digit growth in terms of revenues in 2021 and 2022 across the industry. That is moderating. We're down more in like the 6% range is what we're seeing. We think those numbers might be revised upward a little bit by the time we get final statistics. But growth is moderating. And so as revenue growth moderates, we see some of the other economic KPIs that we tend to follow sort of track alongside of revenue. So if we look at jobs supported in the industry, those were up about 3.4% last year. So 1.6 million jobs supported by the industry. When we look at average wages, we continue to see wage growth, right? And we can talk about some of the specifics about what's driving that, but wages up another 5% to about $109,000. So by and large, just a lot of strength in the industry and a lot of strength across the different KPIs that we're tracking.
Now, 2023, that was a time of some really aggressive Fed activity when it came to interest rates. How have the interest rate hike by the Fed back in 23, and then also the inflationary pressures we've seen across the economy affected some of those numbers?
Yeah, I mean, no doubt it's been a headwind, right? And so we've talked about inflation for a couple of years now, and obviously been tracking closely the impact that inflation's having on both the macro environment and the engineering and design services industry. And it is obviously a very interest rate sensitive industry, certain parts of it. Obviously, when you think about construction and the cost of investment, whether that's residential or non-residential investment, interest rates play a pretty big role. And so, when I talk about that moderating growth, that is really one of the biggest factors that we have in terms of headwinds. And so I think when we think about the fact that interest rates have risen as quickly as they have, and we've had to deal with these inflation rates that we have over the last couple of years, the industry's been really resilient, right? So despite the fact that we've seen these sharp rises in interest rates, we're still seeing 6% plus growth in revenue in 2023. And the good news is, we are at a tipping point. We're at a point now where inflation is coming back in line. We are, if not all the way down to the Federal Reserve's target level of inflation. We are getting close enough that we're starting to see rate cuts, and so we're starting to see rates come back down. We don't think they're going to be down to where they were a couple of years ago, but certainly something that's giving, instead of a headwind, as we look forward, a little bit more of a tailwind to industry performance.
Absolutely. During of course, we're still seeing it now because the money is still not completely spent. But of course, we are in the day of the IIJA and the CHIPS Act and CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. A lot of money going into the marketplace. What's the impact, in your view, of that federal spending for infrastructure and activities where our industry can be engaged?
Yeah, well, it's huge, Jeff, because obviously a lot of that money finds its way ultimately into the engineering and design services industry. We're talking about $1.2 trillion rolled out over a number of years. As of the White House's latest announcement, roughly half of that funding has been assigned. Now, that doesn't mean that funding has actually found its way to these companies or into these projects yet. So we have at least half of that funding still to come. And so we think over the next 4 to 5 years, it's going to continue to be a boon to the industry. And in particular, of course, the end markets that are tied directly to infrastructure. So if we think about water, wastewater, transportation, roads, bridges, et cetera, those parts of the sector are certainly going to benefit over the next couple of years.
In terms of geographic growth, what are the states that we've seen growth in the industry? I noticed that there are a couple of states that seem to have to change pole position, North Carolina, Ohio, Florida, and some others. Where are you seeing real growth or change in geography here with the industry?
Yeah, so the good news is all regions or all states around the country are continuing to see growth in terms of engineering and design services activity. It's relatively strong across the U.S., but as you noted, there are certain regions or states that are outperforming. A lot of those are the states that we've seen outperform over the last couple of years, frankly. When we look at the different census divisions, so there's 9 different census divisions in the U.S., we see the strongest growth coming from the South Atlantic as well as the mountain states. And those trends are sort of following the population trends or the migration trends that we see across the U.S. And so over the last number of years, and this has really been accelerated by what's happened through the pandemic, we have a lot more flexibility these days in terms of where we can live and locate. A lot of people working remotely or having some sort of hybrid work relationship. And we've seen that sort of accelerate this trend towards more affordable markets, again, looking at like the Southeast and even some of the mountain states, as well as those markets that are tied to quality of life. People sort of chase warmer weather or outdoor activities, whatever those they're interested in, they have the ability now more so than ever to go there. And so obviously the built environment tends to follow population, right? Whether we're talking about residential or building office space, apartment buildings, building retail establishments. And so we think that trend is going to continue where people continue to migrate. Obviously, it can't go on forever because at some point, you lose the advantages when you have demand going into these regions, costs go up. And so naturally, from an economic standpoint, there tends to be a tipping point there. But we expect that to continue, over the next couple of years, sort of the trends that we're seeing, in particular, again, the mountain states and the South Atlantic.
Now, let's talk about market sectors, I guess, within the engineering design services industry. What were the market sectors that, kind of were the ones that seem to be the winners, and which are the ones that seem to be cooling off?
Yeah, and so great question. It's something that we look at every year when we really drill down into the data, because obviously it helps member firms really understand where the opportunities are, as we look forward. Obviously, with the interest rate environment, we've seen a slowdown in residential, in particular single family residential, over the last year. But we do think that the market dynamics and the pent up demand for single family residential is going to drive that moving forward. So as interest rates normalize, we think that part of the market is going to do really well. Multifamily, we do see a little bit of oversupply in the marketplace, so we think that there might be some headwinds there over the next few years. In terms of the real high growth areas of the market, I talked about IIJA. I think those are the end markets or sectors that we're really focused on. And so transportation, streets and highways, power. We also see strong growth in education, facilities and construction. In terms of the weakness, relatively speaking, we expect a little bit more weakness in those sectors that tend to be tied more tightly to the macro environment. We are seeing, I talked about this resilience that we're seeing. We are seeing interest rates start to normalize, but we are seeing growth slow a little bit. And as the macro economy starts to slow, those cyclical sectors are going to slow alongside of that. And so when we think about like commercial real estate, when we think about office space, obviously the supply in office space and some of the dynamics we're seeing in the market there leads us to believe that will grow a little slower. Lodging, amusement and recreation, those more cyclical parts of the industry are going to perform relatively worse over the next few years.
Yeah, and want to also bring up the issue of workforce and skills gap, because this is something where we're very engaged in. It's really the hot topic amongst the industry. You talk to any CEO right now, and the sentiment is there that we're turning down work. Interestingly enough, in the Q4 sentiment report, it was turning down profitable work because they don't have the workforce to actually do the job. How has that impacted the industry from a national level in your research?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a hot button issue. As you said, it's hard to have a conversation with somebody, in leadership within the industry, and that not come up as one of their key pain points, right? And so, we continue to see, when we look at the data, the number of job openings running significantly higher than the number of actual hires, right? So, clearly there is a lot of tightness in the labor market. There's a lot of competition for labor. That's also driving up wages and making it even more challenging, because it's not just bringing on people, but bringing on people where you can still operate profitably, right? And work in this tightened environment. So it is a real challenge. It certainly shows up, nationally in the data. Unfortunately, a lot of what we see in terms of looking at the demographics leads us to believe that, it's not a problem that's going away overnight, Jeff, right? Like we've seen the continued tightness in the labor market. And when we look at, for example, the age of workers within engineering and design services firms, we can see that it's about 27% of workers in the industry are 55 or older, right? And so, in other words, nearing retirement age, right? And so these are going to be workers that are leaving the workforce. So it's really a longer term challenge, I think, that we as an industry or firms within the industry need to address in terms of, how do we get younger workers into the workforce? How do we get more productivity out of the workers that we have? It's something that is not going away, tomorrow or the next week or the next month. It's a longer term problem that, I think we're all going to have to address, moving forward. And it's a challenge that's going to be with us for a while.
Yeah, and for those listening from the public policy arena, I mean, I know the focus right now is on government efficiency, but that aging out of the workforce isn't just on the consultant side; it's also on the client side, on DOT side. And DOTs across the country are having problems filling roles because of the really the impacts of COVID, but then also you have a retiring workforce and they're scrambling for people as well. So that has the double threat of persisting this problem, and also slowing down project delivery, which is something that we don't want to have happen. So something on a public policy side to keep watch on. Jon, we covered a lot of ground here. I mean, outside of looking at specific things, is there anything that we didn't bring up that you want to make sure our audience understands about where things are going with the industry?
Yeah, no, like you said, I think we covered kind of the key issues. I think I would just sort of wrap here by saying that, again, the industry is performing very well. There's a lot of opportunities. We talked about some of the challenges. We are seeing growth slow, I should say moderate, really, but we think growth is going to remain above, long-term trend. I mean, everything tells us that the industry is on really solid footing right now. IIJA is obviously a big part of that. The fact that from a macroeconomic standpoint, inflation is coming back in line. We are seeing interest rates start to normalize again. We've avoided this, longest predicted recession in history, right? For the last couple of years.
Yes.
That's all economists have been talking about, is this recession that's on the horizon that just hasn't come, thankfully. And so, and we don't think it's, reading the tea leaves now, we don't think it's coming, over the next couple of quarters. Obviously, there can always be some sort of external factors that we're not anticipating that can cause, challenges, a geopolitical event or something. But, that's not what we see on the horizon. Things look bright. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty still with the incoming Trump administration and what policy is going to look like. I think, we're going to have to wait and see on trade policy and tax policy and how those things shape up. So certainly areas to keep an eye on moving forward. But by and large, things look really good from an industry standpoint. Despite some of the challenges that naturally, we're always going through and having to face as an industry.
Yeah. From an advocacy perspective, that's our focus now. It's going to be tax, trade policy, and workforce. Those are the big items that are kind of screaming out for attention. And I'm sure there'll be others as the new administration changes and takes over in January. But Jon, really do appreciate the work you and your team does at Rockport for producing this study. Really appreciate the time that it goes into really getting the numbers out there. I really encourage anyone out there to go to the ACEC Research Institute's website at acecresearchinstitute.org to download the report. It's right there on the homepage. Take it, use it, share it with your colleagues, and come back for our 2025 at the end of the year. So, Jon, thank you very much for joining us, and I appreciate it very much.
Yep. Thank you, Jeff. Thanks for having me.
And again, this has been Engineering Influence, a podcast from the American Council of Engineering Companies, and we'll see you next time.